I'm worth millions, Carol, and you're just the daughter of a broke, dead mechanic. Sign the papers and get out of my life." Edward Goodale thought he had won. He thought stripping his wife of every penny was the ultimate victory. He signed the divorce papers with a smirk, mocking the woman who built him from nothing. But he forgot one thing. Carol's father might have died a humble man, but he didn't die a fool. Stay tuned, because what happens the second the ink dries isn't just a twist. It's a demolition. You won't believe what the judge reads next. The fluorescent lights of the courtroom antechamber buzzed with a sound that felt like a drill boring directly into Carol Acosta's skull. She sat on the edge of the stiff wooden chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her knuckles were white, the skin rough and dry from months of cleaning houses to make ends meet. A stark contrast to the manicured, soft hands of the man sitting across the mahogany table. Edward Goodale, the man she had loved for 12 years. The man she had supported while he finished business school. The man whose first startup was funded by the second mortgage Carol's father, Matteo, had taken out on his small auto repair shop. Now, Edward looked at her as if she were a stain on his immaculate grey Italian wool suit. "Stop stalling, Carol," Edward sneered, checking his Rolex. It was a Submariner, a gift to himself after his company, Goodale Tech, went public last year. "I have a flight to Cabo in 3 hours. Tiffany is waiting in the car, and unlike you, she doesn't like to be kept waiting." Tiffany, the 23-year-old marketing intern. The cliché was so sharp, it physically hurt. "I'm not stalling, Edward," Carol said, her voice barely a whisper. She looked down at the divorce settlement in front of her. It was thick, heavy with legalese, but the summary was simple. Carol got nothing. According to the pre-nuptial agreement Edward had bullied her into signing years ago, back when he was protecting his future empire, and the aggressive maneuvering of his high-priced legal sharks, she was entitled to 0 alimony. They had argued that since she had no official role in the company, her contribution was negligible. "You're pathetic," Edward laughed, a sharp, barking sound that drew the attention of the stenographer in the corner. "Look at you, wearing that rag of a coat. You really thought you were my partner. You were a stepping stone, honey, a placeholder." Carol's lawyer, a court-appointed representative who looked like he hadn't slept in a week, sighed. "Mrs. Goodale, if you don't sign now, he's going to drag this out. He'll bankrupt you with legal fees before you ever see a trial. It's better to just sever the tie." "Listen to the man," Edward grinned, leaning forward. His cologne, thick and musky, wafted over her, choking her. "Your father was a loser, Carol. A grease monkey who died with debt. You're destined to be just like him. A loser. Now sign the paper so I can go celebrate my freedom." Carol felt a tear, hot and heavy, slide down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. She wanted to remember this pain. She wanted to etch the cruelty of his face into her memory forever. She thought of her father, Matteo. Edward was right about the debt, or so everyone thought. Matteo had died 6 months ago, apparently penniless, his shop seized by creditors. Edward hadn't even attended the funeral. He had been too busy closing a merger. "Don't speak about my father," Carol said, her voice trembling but gaining a strange, steel edge. "I'll speak however I want," Edward shot back, uncapping a gold fountain pen and sliding it toward her across the polished wood. "He's dead. You're broke. And I'm the king of the world. Sign." Carol picked up the pen. It felt heavy. She looked at the signature line. Carol Acosta Goodale. With a shaking hand, she pressed the nib to the paper. The ink flowed dark and permanent. She signed her name. Then, she dated it. Edward snatched the papers away the second she lifted the pen. He blew on the wet ink theatrically, his eyes dancing with malicious delight. "Finally," he crowed, standing up and buttoning his jacket. "The dead weight is gone. You have 30 days to vacate the condo, Carol. Though honestly, I'd start packing tonight. I'm having the locks changed on the 1st. He turned to his lawyer, high-fiving the shark in a suit. "Done. Let's get out of here." "Wait." A booming voice echoed from the heavy oak doors leading to the inner chambers. The door swung open, and Judge Holloway stepped out, followed by a bailiff and a short, stout man carrying a leather briefcase that looked older than everyone in the room. Edward rolled his eyes. "We're done here, Your Honor. The settlement is signed. We were just leaving." "The divorce proceedings are concluded, Mr. Goodale," Judge Holloway said, his face impassive, his eyes hard behind wire-rimmed glasses. "You are now officially divorced, legally strangers." "Exactly," Edward smirked. "So, if you'll excuse me, however," the judge interrupted, his voice dropping an octave. "Mr. Blackwood here acts as the executor of the estate of the late Matteo Acosta, and he has petitioned the court for an immediate reading of the last will and testament, contingent upon a specific legal status of his daughter." Edward laughed, a loud, incredulous bark. "Her father's will? The old man didn't have a pot to piss in. What did he leave her? A set of rusty wrenches?" Mr. Blackwood, the stout man, set the leather case on the table. He didn't look at Edward. He looked at Carol, his eyes filled with a profound, sad warmth. "Not exactly, Mr. Goodale," Blackwood said softly. He clicked the brass latches of the briefcase open. Snap. Snap. The sound rang out like gunshots in the sudden silence of the room. "Sit down, Edward," Carol said. She hadn't moved. She was still staring at the spot where she had signed the paper. "You might want to hear this." Edward remained standing, his hand hovering over the doorknob. He let out an exaggerated groan, checking his Rolex again. "This is ridiculous. The man died with a mountain of medical bills and a mortgage on a shop that was falling apart. I know this because I refused to pay them. So unless he left her a winning lottery ticket, this is a waste of my time." "Sit down, Mr. Goodale," Judge Holloway commanded, his voice cracking like a whip across the room. "Or I will hold you in contempt. The court is not finished with you." Edward stiffened, his jaw clenching. He shot a look of pure venom at Carol, but she didn't flinch. She was watching Mr. Blackwood, the executor, who was adjusting his spectacles with maddening slowness. Reluctantly, Edward sank back into his chair, crossing his arms over his chest like a petulant child. "Proceed, Mr. Blackwood," the judge nodded. Blackwood cleared his throat. He held the document with reverence. The paper yellowed slightly at the edges. "Last will and testament of Matteo Acosta," Blackwood began, his voice steady. "To my beloved daughter Carol, I leave my love. I know you think I am just a simple mechanic. I know you worry about the bills. I lived simply because I wanted to teach you the value of hard work, but also because I needed to protect you from the sharks that swim in shallow waters." Blackwood paused, his eyes flicking briefly to Edward. "Edward, you might want to listen closely to this next part," Blackwood said, breaking protocol. Edward sneered. "Get on with it. How much debt did he leave?" "Article 1. Assets," Blackwood read louder. "It is true that I ran Acosta Auto Repair. However, in 1998, I developed and patented a hydraulic fuel injection stabilizer. It is currently licensed to 3 major aerospace defense contractors and 2 luxury automotive manufacturers, including the maker of the car you drove here today, Mr. Goodale." The silence in the room was absolute. You could hear the hum of the air conditioning unit. Carol blinked, confused. "Patents? Dad invented a part?" "Not just a part, Carol," Blackwood smiled gently. The Standard. For the last 20 years, your father has been silently collecting royalties. He invested 90% of those royalties into a diversified portfolio managed by my firm. He lived off the shop's income to maintain a low profile. Edward's arms uncrossed. His face went slightly pale. Royalties? What kind of valuation are we talking about? Blackwood ignored him. Item 2. The real estate. The auto shop sits on 2 acres of industrial-zoned land in the South District. Developers have been trying to buy it for a decade. Current appraisal for the land alone is $4 million. Edward choked on air. $4 million? Item 3. The portfolio, Blackwood continued, turning the page, consisting of blue-chip stocks, municipal bonds, and the accumulated patent royalties held in the Acosta Family Trust. As of the market close yesterday, the total value of the liquid assets stands at $42,600,000. The number hung in the air like a thunderclap. Carol gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. 42! She couldn't even finish the sentence. Her father, who wore stained coveralls and drove a dented Ford truck, was a multimillionaire. He had scrubbed grease from his fingernails every night, all while sitting on a fortune that could buy Edward's company twice over. Edward looked like he had been struck by a physical blow. The color drained from his face, leaving him a sickly gray. He looked at Carol, then at the papers, then back at Carol. The cruelty in his eyes was instantly replaced by a frantic, calculating greed. "Wait!" Edward stammered, standing up, his voice cracking. "Wait a minute. We were married when he died. California is a community property state. That inheritance is marital property. I'm entitled to half. No, more than half, considering I supported her." He turned to his lawyer, grabbing his arm. "Fix this. Get that money." His lawyer, however, looked sick. He was staring at Judge Holloway, who wore a grim expression of satisfaction. "Sit down, Edward," Blackwood boomed, his voice surprisingly powerful for a small man. "I haven't read the condition of transfer." Edward froze. "What condition?" "Mateo knew you, Edward," Blackwood said, his voice dropping to a cold whisper. "He knew you were a shark. He knew you looked down on him. And he knew that if you found out about the money, you would drain Carol dry and leave her with nothing. So," he added, a specific clause. A trigger. Blackwood turned the page to the final section. "To my daughter Carol, I leave 100% of my estate to be held in a blind trust. She shall not access nor even know of this wealth, so long as she remains legally bound to Edward Goodale." Edward's mouth fell open. "The trust stipulates," Blackwood read clearly, enunciating every syllable, "that the assets shall only be released to Carol Acosta upon the presentation of a final court-certified divorce decree, proving she is free of Edward Goodale's influence and debts, or upon Edward Goodale's death." The judge leaned forward, tapping the stack of papers Edward had just signed, the papers that were still sitting on the table, the ink barely dry. The divorce was finalized at 10:02 a.m. Judge Holloway checked the clock on the wall. "It is now 10:07 a.m. Mr. Goodale, by rushing this divorce, by bullying your wife into a settlement to get her out of your life quickly, you have successfully unlocked her inheritance. And," the judge added, with a shark-like smile of his own, "since you signed a waiver of all future claims to her assets in your haste to protect your own millions, you have legally blocked yourself from touching a single cent of the Acosta fortune." Edward slumped back into his chair, his legs giving out. He looked at the divorce decree, the paper he had practically thrown at Carol moments ago. He had signed it to save himself alimony. In doing so, He had cost himself $21 million. Carol slowly stood up. The shock was fading, replaced by a warm, rising tide of realization. Her father hadn't left her destitute. He had left her protected. He had played the long game, from the grave. She looked at Edward, really looked at him, for the first time in years without fear. He wasn't a titan of industry. He was a small, greedy man who had just played himself. "Edward?" she said softly. He looked up, his eyes wild with panic. "Carol, baby, listen. We can annul this. It's been 5 minutes. We can—" "Get out," she whispered. "Get out," Carol had whispered. But the words hit Edward harder than a scream. Panic, primal and ugly, surged through him. He lunged toward the table, his manicured fingers clawing for the divorce decree he had signed with such arrogance only minutes before. "It hasn't been filed," Edward shrieked, his voice cracking. "It's not in the system yet. I rescind my signature. I rescind it." "Mr. Goodale, sit down." Judge Holloway slammed his gavel, the sound echoing like a gunshot. "The clerk filed the electronic record the moment you signed. It is done. Touch those papers, and you'll spend the night in a holding cell." Edward froze, his hand trembling inches from the document. He looked at his own lawyer, the shark in the expensive suit, begging for a lifeline. The lawyer closed his briefcase with a definitive click. "It's over, Edward. You signed the waiver. If we challenge this now, we're arguing fraud on a document you drafted. You'll be disbarred from the board of your own company for incompetence. Let it go." "Let it go," Edward hissed, spit flying. "That's $42 million. $42 million that belongs to Ms. Acosta," Mr. Blackwood interjected smoothly, closing his own battered briefcase. He stood up and offered an arm to Carol. "Shall we, my dear? We have much to discuss. I believe there is a matter of a trust fund to activate." Carol looked at Blackwood's kind eyes, then back at Edward. The man was sweating, his face blotchy. He looked small. For the first time in 12 years, the giant who cast a shadow over her life had shrunk to the size of an insect. She took Blackwood's arm. "Yes, let's go." As they turned to leave, Edward scrambled over the table, actually scrambled, knocking over a pitcher of water to block their path. "Carol, wait! Please!" He grabbed her shoulders, his grip desperate. "You're not thinking clearly. This was a test." Carol stared at his hands on her cheap coat. "A test?" "Yes, a test of your resilience." Edward's eyes were wild, improvising lies at the speed of light. "I knew your father had money. I knew. I had to make sure you were strong enough to handle it without me. The divorce. It was just a strategy to hide the assets from the IRS. I did it for us, baby. For our future." It was such a pathetic, transparent lie that Carol almost laughed. Instead, she felt a wave of nausea. "You called my father a loser 10 minutes ago, Edward," she said, her voice steady. "You kicked me out of my home. You introduced your mistress to my friends. That wasn't a test. That was you." She shrugged his hands off her shoulders as if they were covered in slime. "Don't touch me," she said. "Carol, don't walk away. You need me to manage that money. You don't know anything about finance. You're a maid," he screamed after her as she walked through the heavy oak doors. The hallway was cool and quiet, a sanctuary compared to the madness inside. But the drama wasn't over. As Carol and Mr. Blackwood walked toward the exit, the double doors at the end of the hall burst open. Tiffany, clad in a pink designer tracksuit that cost more than Carol's car, stood there, scrolling on her phone. "Finally!" Tiffany squealed, looking up. "Eddie, babe, did you sign? Can we go? I booked the spa at—" She stopped. She saw Carol walking with a strange man, looking calm. Then she saw Edward sprinting down the hall behind them, tie askew, face red, looking like a madman. "Eddie?" Tiffany asked, confused. Edward didn't even slow down. He barreled past Tiffany, nearly knocking her into a trash can. "Move, Tiffany, not now." "Excuse me," Tiffany gasped, her jaw dropping. "You said we were popping champagne." "Shut up," Edward roared, still chasing Carol. "Carol, wait!" They burst out into the bright California sunshine. The courthouse parking lot was bustling. A sleek, black town car was idling at the curb. Mr. Blackwood's ride, clearly arranged beforehand. "Please, Carol." Edward caught up just as the chauffeur opened the rear door. He threw himself between Carol and the car door, panting heavily. "Listen to me. I can change. I can fix this. We can annul the divorce tomorrow. We just say it was a mistake. We go back to how it was." Carol looked at him. She saw the sweat on his forehead. She saw the greed in his eyes. There was no love there. Only a desperate hunger for the fortune he had let slip through his fingers. "Go back to how it was?" Carol asked. "Me cleaning your floors while you sleep with your intern? Me begging for grocery money while you buy Rolexes? I'll fire her." Edward pointed a trembling finger back at the courthouse entrance, where Tiffany was now standing, looking shocked and furious. "I'll fire Tiffany right now. I'll buy you a house. Anything." "You can't buy me anything, Edward," Carol said, a small, sad smile touching her lips. "Because I have $42 million. And you? You have a flight to Cabo." She stepped around him and slid into the cool leather interior of the town car. "Drive," Mr. Blackwood said to the chauffeur as he got in beside her. Edward banged on the window as the car pulled away. "Carol, I love you. Carol." As the car merged into traffic, Carol didn't look back. She looked in the rearview mirror. She saw Edward standing in the exhaust fumes, screaming. Behind him, Tiffany was throwing her expensive purse at his head. For the first time in a year, Carol Acosta leaned back and breathed. "So," Mr. Blackwood said, opening a small cooler in the back seat and pulling out a glass bottle of sparkling water. "Your father also left instructions for a wardrobe update. He said, and I quote, 'Get her something that makes her look like the CEO she's about to become.'" Carol looked at the old lawyer. "CEO?" Blackwood smiled, a mischievous glint in his eye. "Oh, didn't I mention? The trust holds a majority voting share in the conglomerate that supplies the microchips for Goodale Tech. You're not just rich, Carol. As of this morning, you're Edward's boss. Guys, you have to see this. The king of tech just got dethroned by his side piece in a parking lot. #GoodaleFail, #TeamCarol. The tweet had 40,000 retweets, but the video attached to it, that had 12 million views. Edward sat in his corner office, the panoramic view of Silicon Valley, usually a source of immense pride, now feeling like a glass cage. On his tablet, the video played on a loop. It was shaky footage shot by a bystander in the courthouse parking lot. It showed everything. Edward sprinting like a maniac, Tiffany throwing her Birkin bag at his head, and most damning of all, the audio, crystal clear. "You're a maid. I'll fire her. I'll fire Tiffany right now." Edward slammed the tablet face down. His PR team had quit 3 days ago. Tiffany hadn't just left. She had launched a tell-all series on TikTok titled Surviving the CEO, gaining 1 million followers overnight by detailing his cheapskate habits and his obsession with his hair. "Mr. Goodale!" His assistant, a terrified young man named Kevin, poked his head in. "The board is on line 1. Again, they're asking about the Vanguard contract." Edward rubbed his temples. The humiliation was bad, but the business crisis was fatal. Goodale Tech's flagship product, the OmniLink, relied entirely on a specific microchip manufactured by Vanguard Systems. For the last month, ever since the divorce, Vanguard had been stalling. Shipments were delayed, invoices were under review, and now they had called for an emergency renegotiation of terms. "Tell them I'm handling it," Edward snapped. "I'm meeting the Vanguard chairman at their headquarters in an hour. I'll charm the old geezer. I always do." Edward stood up, adjusting his suit. He looked tired. The bags under his eyes were heavy, and he'd lost weight. He grabbed his briefcase. He needed this win. If he could secure the supply chain, the stock would rebound, and the viral video would be forgotten news. 30 minutes later, Edward's car pulled up to the Vanguard Systems skyscraper. It was an imposing building of steel and glass, actually taller than his own HQ. He marched into the lobby, ignoring the whispers of the receptionists, who definitely recognized him from the parking lot breakup video. "Edward Goodale to see the chairman," he announced imperiously. "They are expecting you in the Solstice boardroom, 40th floor," the receptionist said, not making eye contact. The elevator ride was silent and tense. Edward rehearsed his pitch. "Look, we're partners. We grow, you grow. Stop playing games." He would be firm but charming, dominant. The doors opened. The 40th floor was sleek, minimalist, and intimidating. A woman in a sharp navy suit led him down a long corridor to double-glass doors. "The chairman is waiting," she said, opening the door. Edward strode in. The room was massive, dominated by a 20-foot table of black marble. At the far end, a high-backed leather chair was turned away from him, facing the window that looked out over the city. "Mr. Chairman," Edward projected his voice, putting on his best sales smile. "Thank you for seeing me. I know there have been some hiccups in our supply chain, but I'm here to smooth things over personally." The chair didn't move. "We need to guarantee the Q3 shipment," Edward continued, pacing slightly. "Goodale Tech is about to launch the device of the decade. You want to be part of that history. I'm prepared to offer a 2% increase on the unit price." Generous, I know. Still silence. Edward frowned. "Look, I know you've heard rumors about my personal life. Ignore the noise. The company is solid. I am solid. Now turn around so we can shake on this." "A 2% increase?" A voice came from the chair. It wasn't the gravelly voice of an old man. It was cool, smooth, and terrifyingly familiar. "That barely covers inflation, Edward. My father taught me to never accept the first offer." Edward stopped breathing. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. The chair slowly swiveled around. Carol sat there. But it wasn't the Carol he knew. The faded coat was gone. She wore a tailored white suit that screamed power. Her hair, usually tied back in a messy bun, was cut into a sharp, chic bob. She wore no jewelry except for a simple gold pin on her lapel, the logo of Vanguard Systems. She didn't look like a maid. She didn't look like a mechanic's daughter. She looked like a queen on her throne. "Carol?" Edward whispered, his voice failing him. "What are you doing here? Where is the chairman?" "The chairman retired to his vineyard in Napa last week," Carol said, lacing her fingers together on the marble table. "He sold his voting shares to the Acosta Trust. As of Monday morning, I am the chairwoman of the board." She picked up a file, a thick blue folder with the Goodale Tech logo on it. "And frankly, Edward," she said, opening the file and clicking a gold pen, "I'm not impressed with your quarterly projections or your credit rating." Edward stumbled back, gripping the edge of the table for support. You own Vanguard?" "I own the company that makes the heart of your machine," Carol corrected him, her eyes cold and hard. "Without my chips, your OmniLink is just an expensive paperweight." She slid a document across the long black table. It stopped perfectly at the edge, right in front of him. "This is the new contract," she said. Edward looked down at it. His eyes bulged. This is insanity," he sputtered. "A 40% price hike, exclusive rights to my patents, and a morals clause." "Read the fine print, Eddie," Carol smiled, and it was the most dangerous thing he had ever seen. "If the CEO of the purchasing entity, that's you, is involved in any public scandal deemed damaging to the Vanguard brand, we reserve the right to terminate supply immediately." She pulled out her phone and tapped the screen. The sound of Tiffany screaming, "You're a cheap liar," filled the boardroom. Carol paused the video. "I'd say you're currently in breach of contract," she said softly. "So you have two choices. Sign the new deal and resign as CEO of Goodale Tech, effective immediately. Or I cut your supply line today, and your stock goes to zero by lunch." Edward stared at her. The trap hadn't just snapped shut. It was crushing him. "You can't do this," he pleaded, his arrogance evaporating into tears. "I built that company, and my father built the engine that runs it," Carol replied, closing the folder. "Tick-tock, Edward. The market opens in 10 minutes. 9 minutes, Carol said, checking her watch. It was a simple, elegant timepiece. No diamonds, just understated power. "The pre-market trading is already showing a wobble, Edward. The street is nervous." Edward Goodale, the man who had been featured on the cover of Forbes as the Disruptor, felt sweat trickle down his spine, soaking his expensive dress shirt. He looked at the contract, then at Carol, then out the window at the sprawling city he thought he owned. "If I sign this," Edward croaked, his voice raw, "I want a press release stating I'm stepping down for personal reasons. To focus on my health. No mention of the scandal. No mention of this." "I don't control the press, Edward," Carol replied, her tone deceptively light. "I only control the supply chain. But if you sign right now, Vanguard won't issue a statement regarding the termination of our contract. Your stock won't crash. You'll keep the value of your equity." That was it. The lifeline. Edward's mind raced. If he resigned, he lost the title, but he kept his shares. He was still the majority shareholder. He could take his hundreds of millions, move to a non-extradition country, and live like a king. He didn't need the headache of running the company anyway. "Fine," he spat. "You win, I'll retire. I'll take my golden parachute and I'll disappear. You'll never see me again." He grabbed the gold pen, the same pen he had used to sign the divorce papers with such glee only days ago. His hand shook violently as he scrawled his signature on the resignation letter Carol had helpfully drafted. Edward Goodale. It looked like the signature of a dying man. "Done!" He shoved the paper toward her. "Now call off the dogs. Sign the supply deal." Carol picked up the paper, inspecting the signature as if checking for a forgery. She nodded slowly, then placed it into the blue folder. "Thank you, Edward," she said. She reached for the desk phone and pressed a single button. "Security? Please escort Mr. Goodale to the elevator. He is leaving the premises." "I can walk myself out," Edward snarled, straightening his tie. He felt a surge of relief. He was rich. He was free. He turned to leave, grabbing his briefcase. "Enjoy the chair, Carol. It's harder than it looks." "Oh, Edward," Carol called out, just as his hand touched the door handle. "One last thing." He stopped. "What?" "You mentioned your golden parachute. The severance package. Yeah? It's $30 million plus vested stock options. It's in my contract." Carol tapped the blue folder. "Actually, as the new voting majority of the Vanguard Group, which is the primary creditor for Goodale Tech's debt restructuring, I took the liberty of reviewing your employment bylaws last night." Edward's stomach dropped. "So?" You really should have read the bad lever clause you added to your own executive contracts 3 years ago. You put it in to stop your VP from defecting to Apple, remember? Edward remembered. He had been so proud of that clause. It stated that any executive who resigned under duress caused by gross moral turpitude or public scandal forfeited all unvested stock and severance pay. That doesn't apply, Edward stammered. I'm resigning for health reasons. We agreed. You resigned to stop me from bankrupting the company, Carol corrected him, her eyes flashing. And considering the TikTok incident with Tiffany is currently trending at number 1 globally, the board of Goodale Tech has just convened an emergency meeting. She glanced at her phone, which buzzed with a notification. Ah, there it is, she smiled, showing him the screen. It was a news alert from Bloomberg. Breaking. Goodale Tech Board accepts CEO resignation amidst scandal, invokes bad lever clause. Edward Goodale ousted with 0 severance. The room spun. 0, Edward whispered. But my stock, my equity. Your equity is tied up in the divorce freeze until the final audit is complete, Carol explained calmly. And since you just admitted to gross moral turpitude by resigning to save face, the company lawyers are going to claw back every bonus you've paid yourself in the last 5 years. Edward fell against the doorframe. He couldn't breathe. He had signed away his job to save his money, only to find out the signature itself was the trigger that destroyed his fortune. Security, Carol said to the 2 burly guards who had just appeared in the doorway. Please remove this trespasser. He's disturbing the workflow. This isn't over, Edward screamed as the guards grabbed his arms. The polished veneer of the CEO finally cracked completely, revealing the frightened, angry child beneath. I'll sue you. I'll sue everyone. Get in line, Edward, Carol said, turning her chair back to the window to look at the city she now commanded. I believe the IRS is ahead of you. The guards dragged him out. Edward was hauled down the long corridor, past the glass-walled offices where people stared. He was shoved into the elevator. The ride down was a blur of nausea and rage. When the doors opened to the lobby, he expected to slink away in shame. But the universe wasn't done with him yet. The lobby was packed. Not with customers, but with cameras. Flashbulbs exploded like fireworks. Reporters shouted his name, and standing at the front of the pack, holding a microphone and looking vindictive, was Tiffany. There he is! Tiffany yelled for her live stream. The man who promised me a villa and tried to pay for dinner with a company card that got declined this morning. Edward shielded his eyes, trying to push through the mob. No comment! Get away from me! Mr. Goodale, is it true you're under investigation for embezzlement? Mr. Goodale, did you really make your wife sleep in the guest room? Edward, look at the camera! He stumbled out onto the street, his suit torn, his hair wild. He reached into his pocket for his car keys, desperate to get into his Aston Martin and drive until the gas ran out. He clicked the unlock button. Nothing happened. He clicked it again. A tow truck driver, leaning against the hood of the Aston Martin, shook his head. Bank repossession, pal. Order came in 10 minutes ago. Something about a violation of asset covenants. Edward stood on the sidewalk. No job, no severance, no car. A mob of reporters behind him. And 40 floors up, watching from a pristine window, the woman he had called a loser was sipping water and getting back to work. His phone buzzed. A text from his lawyer. I'm resigning as your counsel. Your retainer check bounced. Good luck. 3 weeks later, Edward Goodale sat on the edge of a mattress that smelled faintly of mildew and stale cigarette smoke. The golden boy of Silicon Valley was currently residing in room 14 of the Starlight Motel, a place where the starlight came mostly from the flashing neon vacancy sign buzzing outside his window. He was watching the small, bolted-down television. On the screen, Entertainment Tonight was broadcasting live from the event of the season, the inaugural Mateo Acosta Innovation Gala. "It's a Cinderella story for the digital age," the reporter gushed, the camera panning across a glittering ballroom filled with senators, tech moguls, and A-list celebrities. Carol Acosta, the reclusive heiress and new chairwoman of the Vanguard Group, has pledged $50 million tonight to fund engineering scholarships for underprivileged youth. Edward stared at the screen, a half-eaten cup of instant noodles in his hand. There she was. Carol. She looked breathtaking. She wore a gown of midnight blue velvet that shimmered under the lights, her hair swept up in an elegant chignon. She was laughing at something a senator was saying, her hand resting lightly on the arm of a handsome man. Dr. Aris Thorne, a Nobel Prize-winning physicist Edward had tried to hire for years, but who had always refused his calls. Edward threw the noodle cup at the wall. It exploded in a spray of salty broth. "That's my money!" he screamed at the empty room. "That's my life!" He hadn't just lost his job. The clawback was brutal. The company lawyers had frozen his personal accounts. The IRS had seized his penthouse. Even his credit cards were dead. He had sold his Rolex to pay for this motel room. He looked at his reflection in the cracked mirror. He hadn't shaved in 4 days. His eyes were bloodshot. He looked like a madman. "I need to talk to her," he muttered, pacing the small room. "If I can just talk to her, explain that I was under stress, remind her of the good times. She'll break. She always breaks. She's weak." He grabbed his one remaining suit, wrinkled and stained, and shoved his feet into his scuffed dress shoes. He wasn't done yet. He was Edward Goodale. He could charm anyone. He just needed to get into that room. Getting into the gala was harder than Edward expected. The event was held at the city's Museum of Modern Art. Security was tight, but Edward knew the service entrances. He had hosted events here before. He slipped in through the catering loading dock, dodging a tray of canapes. He smoothed his hair back with water from a bathroom sink, straightened his tie, and took a deep breath. Showtime. He walked out into the main ballroom. The air smelled of expensive perfume and success. The murmur of conversation was a low, rich hum. He scanned the crowd. He saw former business partners, men he had golfed with, men who had toasted his genius. "Bob!" Edward exclaimed, spotting the CEO of a major venture capital firm. He rushed over, forcing a smile. "Bob, good to see you. Crazy few weeks, huh? Listen, I've got a new pitch. It's going to blow OmniLink out of the water. I just need a small seed round—" Bob turned. He looked Edward up and down, taking in the frayed cuffs and the desperate eyes. "Security," Bob said, lifting a finger without even breaking eye contact. "Bob, come on, it's me. Edward." "I don't know you," Bob said coldly, turning his back. "And looking at you now, I wonder if I ever did." Edward reeled back as if slapped. He looked around. Eyes were averting. People were stepping away from him, creating a small, isolated circle of shame around him in the middle of the crowded room. He was radioactive. Then, the crowd parted. Carol was walking toward the stage, followed by an entourage. She looked radiant, powerful, and untouchable. Edward lunged. "Carol!" he shouted, breaking through the line of waiters. The music stopped. The chatter died. 300 heads turned. Carol stopped halfway to the stage. She turned slowly. Her expression didn't change. There was no fear, no anger, just a mild curiosity, as if she were looking at a piece of abstract art she didn't quite understand. "Edward," she said. Her voice was amplified by the acoustics of the room, clear and calm. "You're not on the guest list." I need to talk to you, Edward panted, walking into the open space between them. He spread his arms wide. Look at me, Carol. Look what you've done. You've destroyed me. I haven't done anything to you, Edward, Carol replied, clasping her hands in front of her. I simply stopped saving you from yourself. I was your husband, Edward screamed, tears of rage and self-pity streaming down his face. I gave you a life. I took you out of that garage. I made you someone. A gasp rippled through the crowd. Dr. Thorne stepped forward protectively, but Carol held up a hand to stop him. She took a step toward Edward. Her heels clicked on the marble floor. You didn't make me, Edward, she said, her voice dropping to a register that commanded absolute silence. You hid me. You were ashamed of me. You were ashamed of my father. You used his money to build your empire, and you treated his daughter like a servant in her own home. I loved you, Edward lied, his voice cracking. I still love you. Please, Carol, I have nothing. I'm living in a motel. Just give me a chance. Let me come home. He fell to his knees. The great Edward Goodale, kneeling on the floor in a wrinkled suit, begging the woman he had discarded. Carol looked down at him. For a second, Edward saw a flicker of emotion in her eyes. He hoped it was love. He prayed it was mercy. It was pity. You can't come home, Edward, she said softly. Because I sold the condo this morning. Edward's head snapped up. What? I sold it, she continued. And the furniture, and the art. I liquidated everything from our life together. And I donated the entire sum, $6 million, to a legal defense fund for women trapped in financially abusive marriages. The crowd erupted in applause. It started slow, then grew into a thunderous ovation. Edward looked around, wide-eyed. They were cheering for his destruction. You witch, he hissed, scrambling to his feet. You can't do this. I'll kill you. He lunged at her. He made it 2 steps before he was tackled, not by security, but by Mr. Blackwood. The stout little lawyer moved with surprising speed, hooking Edward's leg with his cane and sending him sprawling. Before Edward could recover, 2 large security guards had him pinned to the floor. Carol stood over him, looking like a judge handing down a sentence. Get him out of here, she said, turning her back on him, and tell the kitchen to bring out the dessert. I believe we're celebrating. As he was dragged backward, kicking and screaming, Edward saw Carol take the microphone on stage. She didn't even look back at the doors. Ladies and gentlemen, she began, smiling at the crowd. Thank you for that colorful interlude. It serves as a reminder of why we are here. To leave the past behind, and to build a future where worth is determined by character, not by a bank account. The doors slammed shut in Edward's face, muffling the sound of the applause that was meant for her, and only her. The applause from the ballroom had long faded, replaced by the soft hum of the city at 2 a.m. Carol stood on the balcony of the penthouse suite she had rented for the night, not for the luxury, but for the security. Her hands, resting on the cold railing, were steady. He's in custody. Mr. Blackwood's voice came from the open glass door behind her. Assault, trespassing, and resisting arrest. Since he lunged at you in front of 3 senators and the police commissioner, I don't think he'll be making bail anytime soon. Carol didn't turn around. She looked out at the skyline, dotted with lights. Somewhere out there, in a cold holding cell, sat the man who had controlled her every breath for a decade. I don't feel happy, Carol admitted quietly. I thought I would. I thought seeing him destroyed would make me feel victorious. But I just feel tired. Mr. Blackwood stepped onto the balcony. He wasn't carrying his briefcase for once. He held 2 mugs of hot cocoa, a stark contrast to the champagne that had flowed downstairs. That's because you are a good person, Carol, he said, handing her a mug. Revenge is a fire. It burns your enemies. But if you hold on to it too long, it burns you too. Your father didn't leave you this money to destroy, Edward. He left it to free you. Carol took a sip. The chocolate was rich and warm. Did Dad know? Did he really know it would end like this? Blackwood chuckled softly. Matteo was a mechanic. He understood how things worked. He knew that if you put too much pressure on a weak part, it snaps. Edward was always a weak part. Shiny, but brittle. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small sealed envelope. He told me to give you this only when the pest was gone, Blackwood said. Carol set her mug down and took the envelope. Her name was written on it in grease-stained handwriting. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She tore it open. Inside was a single index card. Mia, if you are reading this, the rat is gone. Good. Now, stop looking at the rear-view mirror. You can't drive forward if you're staring at what's behind you. Build something beautiful and buy yourself a comfortable pair of shoes. Love, Dad. Carol laughed, a genuine, bubbling laugh that released the tension in her chest. Tears pricked her eyes, but they weren't tears of grief. They were tears of relief. He was right about the shoes, she said, kicking off her designer heels and standing barefoot on the cool concrete. These things are killing me. 3 days later, Edward Goodale was arraigned. The courtroom was different this time. It wasn't the high-end family court with mahogany tables. It was a municipal court, crowded and smelling of bleach. He wore an orange jumpsuit. His head was shaved, lice protocol at the county jail. He looked 10 years older. Mr. Goodale, the judge said, looking over his file with disdain. You are charged with assault and battery, stalking, and violation of a restraining order. How do you plead? Edward looked at the public defender assigned to him, a young, overworked woman who hadn't even looked him in the eye. I want to call my lawyer, Edward croaked. You don't have a lawyer, Mr. Goodale, the judge replied. You have the state. Now, how do you plead? Edward looked at the back of the courtroom. He hoped, perhaps irrationally, that Carol would be there, that she would come to save him one last time, that she would see him in orange and feel that old pang of guilt. But the benches were empty. No Tiffany, no business partners, no Carol. He was truly alone. Guilty, Edward whispered. The gavel banged. While Edward was being led back to his cell, Carol was sitting in a boardroom at Vanguard Systems. The atmosphere was electric. The scholarship fund is fully capitalized, Dr. Aris Thorne said, sliding a report across the table. He looked at Carol with a respect that bordered on awe. And the new patents for the eco-stabilizers are ready for filing. But Carol, are you sure about the name? Carol looked at the branding mock-ups on the screen. The logo was a simple, stylized gear. I'm sure, she said firmly. The screen displayed the new company name, replacing the Goodale Tech branding that was being stripped from buildings all over the city. Acosta Dynamics. My father built the engine, Carol said, echoing the words she had spoken to Edward. It's time his name was on the hood. She stood up, smoothing her skirt. Now, if you'll excuse me, gentlemen. I have a date. The room went silent. Dr. Thorne raised an eyebrow, looking hopeful. A date? He asked. Yes, Carol smiled, grabbing her keys. With a 1968 Mustang Fastback that needs a new transmission. I'm going to the shop. She walked out of the glass tower, not as a victim, not even as a survivor, but as a builder. The nightmare of Edward Goodale was over. The legacy of Matteo Acosta had just begun. Edward Goodale spent his whole life thinking that wealth made him a king, and that people like Matteo Acosta were just stepping stones. He signed those divorce papers thinking he was throwing away trash, but instead, he threw away the winning lottery ticket. In the end, Edward got exactly what he deserved, a minimum wage reality check. And Carol, she proved that the most powerful engine in the world isn't made of microchips, it's made of integrity, patience, and a little bit of grease. Talk about a tune-up. If you enjoyed seeing the king of tech get scrubbed down to size, make sure to hit that like button. It really helps the channel. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a story about sweet, sweet revenge. What would you have done with the $42 million? Would you have saved Edward, or would you have let him scrub tires? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one. Remember, guys, be careful who you step on while you're climbing the ladder, because you might meet them on the way down, and they might be holding a wrench. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.